warranty the week after you get it home. We get the game home, and the only return on investment we get is the 30 cents GameStop wants to give us for a trade.
Dude.
We're essentially stuck with the investment.
Dude, I gotta show you something. Can you turn your mic on for a second, though? Fuck. I got some weird messages from someone on here. That shit was weird. At first I was like, alright, whatever, maybe he's trying to learn how to fight that shit. And then I started to think about it, and I was talking to someone else in my party. Oh, that was fucking funny.
Welcome to the stage of history. Are 6 words I've wanted to shout down the side of a mountain since plopping this game in for the first time on 9/9/1999. Though Soul Calibur never really seemed to take a place in mainstream Americana's hard like Street Fighter and Smash Brothers have, they used to be a really big deal as tech demos. More for animation fluidity and character fidelity than anything else, but in my experience, what made them such a big deal was that unlike most fighting games, Soul Calibur usually gives you a few really fun single-player modes. And half of that fun was stretching the limits of a purportedly historical setting that really transcends history and the world to bring us a tale of a magical sentient demon sword that turns people into vampires and opens up a portal to a psycho-mental hell realm fought over by women in their underwear who slice each other's brains out with weapons that don't kill each other? Elvis! If you'd like to let me know how aware you are of how much nonsense these games are, then please spam the following comment below. You know what's not nonsense, though, is knowing the real-life historical context that leads to what we more often than not label as pop culture nonsense. So, here we go. What did Namco get most hilariously right and wrong here? What's the real historical context behind the fantasy historical context? How did we, as a society, end up here in the first place? The answers may surprise you. So for Soul Calibur 6, the menus in the game finally nail down a specific year all this stupid stuff is supposed to happen. 1583. So what was going on in the world in 1583? Well, for starters, the world's largest population would have been in China or India, just like today, but the world's largest economic and military power would have been the Spanish monarchy headed by King Philip II. To speak in general, for the 600 years before 1583, which is going back from the time of Julius Caesar to the time of Leonardo da Vinci, Europe's economic and political nerve center would have usually been some city in what would become Italy. And the 1500s was the first century that saw its preeminence over the rest of Europe finally permanently shift away.
I would switch the song myself. Not because it's a bad song, but because you can get a better effect.
And after centuries of catching up to population levels from before the Black Plague of the 1300s,
because
the various monarchs leading modern-day France, Spain, and England,
the video
productivity and tax revenue of that
is funny, right? But the song doesn't really like play on that or add to it.
Before industrialism, before the masses were
So, not that it's bad the way it is, it's fine. But you could pick a song that's like, you know, adds to the comedy of it. Like I'm gonna make a similar video, not with the boot stomp, but like with Ivy's lethal hits. And I was gonna use the Push It to the Limit song. I was gonna use this song right here, let's see. Because I think this shit's kind of like, it's known, and it's funny. So come on, imagine like your video or one I make with lethal hits with this song. That shit would be funny as hell, and no one's done anything of that. All the videos you see on this shit are normally like serious music or, you know. I don't know, I think that'd be funny.
Wealth would ever be generated by mankind on planet Earth, and that it would have to be generated very slowly and very miserably at that. Oh, and yeah, killing your neighbors over denominational religious intolerance was way more normal back then. Basically, you had a world full of states whose leaders genuinely believed that it was their moral responsibility to take as much wealth as possible. So while this period may be called the Age of Discovery, the Late Renaissance, or the Age of Exploration, let's curb the romanticism and be realistic. If you rolled the dice and happened to be born 400 years earlier, you statistically weren't likely to make it to the age of 5. And if you did, you'd likely be working 14-hour days in miserable conditions as the same exact kind of human being, but as an entirely different personality, without the ability to read, without public education, one with little to no knowledge of medicine, history, and the outside world in general. In England, literacy rates hovered around 15%, and 12% of children didn't make it to the end of their first year, which brought average life expectancy down to the age of 40. And this is with Europe recovering from the quote-unquote Dark Ages, the very real decline in safety, health, wealth, physical infrastructure, and bureaucratic infrastructure among the former Western colonies of the Western Roman Empire, while the Eastern Roman Empire on the way to Eastern Europe did continue to exist fine for like a millennium. While the Islamic caliphates were going through a golden age, heavily patronizing scholars developing math, astronomy, and physics, and the spread of those ideas would spark the Renaissance back in Western Europe, leading to the incentive to further trade east, which led to the expensive voyages that romanticizes Soul Calibur's setting as an age of discovery. Meanwhile, in Asia...
My country, the Ming Empire, you know it, right? It's going through some hard times. Violence is the norm. In the hope of saving our land, the Emperor asked me directly to search for the hero's sword.
Many historians claim that the Ming Empire of China was the world's largest economy throughout the 1300s and 1400s, and also one of the world's largest and most advanced navies during the time, one that would have rivaled Spain's. Fun thing to think about, though, is that they didn't use the fleet for conquering in the name of Christianity more so than for coercion in the name of Confucianism. These ships were used to collect for a tributary system that had the Chinese exchanging gifts with societies along the Indian Ocean and eastern coast of Africa. But during Soul Calibur's century, the current Ming Emperor's court was succumbing to infighting. They made some bad deals with the Europeans that depleted their silver reserves, thus popularizing paper currency, which did not stop the inflation that was keeping taxes unaffordable for the peasants. The farmers were suffering from natural disasters, so they organized a 10-year-long peasant rebellion that managed to capture Beijing, and then Beijing got taken again a year later by the Qing dynasty, which would have been a good lifetime after this game's events, but the infighting, the conflicts between the emperor and his court that is associated with that decline, was underway by the 1580s. In retrospect, her comment towards violence being the norm does seem like an exaggeration, considering that most of that civil warring was happening in the 1640s. Weird thing is, though, despite peasant rebellions and civil wars and dynastic takeovers, if you happen to be born 400 years earlier than today, you'd still probably be rolling for a higher statistical chance of having a better standard of living in Ming China than if you ended up in the Azuchi Momoyoma period in Japan.
Let's see. Sounds like electro-industrial.
When the island was still split up into warring shoguns. Oda Nobunaga's ambition to unify Japan failed because of betrayal, but the next most powerful daimyo in line who managed unification then made it harder for everyone to quit their jobs. Then he led an invasion into Korea that failed. Then he invaded again and failed again. Then he crucified the Christians. 30 years later, Japan decides to just not interact with the outside world at all for 250 years. But a century earlier, which is still a surprisingly recent time in the grand scheme of things, in 1470s Okinawa, we can see the real genesis of Soul Calibur begin. In 1477, the Okinawan king seized everyone's weapons. So its noble scholars, who had the free time to practice martial arts and the need to protect themselves, even when in court, developed new martial arts out of Chinese books imported in the earlier century. These early karate experts developed routines called kata, in which deliberate body movements would carefully transition one defensive posture to the next, occasionally sneaking extensions of the performer's limbs in and out, using movements versatile and distracting enough to improvise strikes into them. A kata is a training method, a pre-scripted martial arts dance routine drilled into students from sheer repetition so they could execute it on muscle memory, using their more immediate mental faculties to strategically transition those moves into strikes for the unpredictability of a real fight. And the unlockable katas in the first 3 games, which were driven by a cutting-edge passive optical motion capture animation system that smoothly transitions every fighter's moves into the next, truly illustrates the marriage between the history, culture, and technology that humans combine together to create art. And Soul Calibur is no exception. And though East met West from day one in this series, that cultural context explains why the history of Soul Calibur's Japanese characters is played far straighter than its European characters. Even someone as zany as Yoshimitsu is based on multiple aspects of Japanese history. He shares a name with the real-life shogun, Ashikaga Yoshimitsu, whose relations with the Chinese have labeled him a traitor by the rest of Japan. This has created a legacy of the name Yoshimitsu being associated with betrayal in Japanese media. And the Yoshimitsu of Soul Calibur has a questionable backstory full of friends and lords betraying him. Also, his costumes are typically the most period accurate out of the whole cast. And even someone like Taki has a historical analog here, because sexy female ninjas are believed to have been a real-life phenomenon. Thanks to the 17th century Book of the Ninja, the Banzen Shukai, mentioning that women were employed as ninjas, covering as maids to spy against, though not exactly fight or assassinate, their employer's enemies. While the Banzen Shukai is a primary historical source, the questionable life of Mochiziku Chiyome, a late 16th century Japanese noblewoman whose very existence is disputed, inadvertently created the archetype of the sexy fighting kunoichi you see all over video games and anime. A 1970s book speculated that this woman lived a double life as a spy master of a clan of all-female ninjas who used cover jobs as courtesans and performers, rather than maids, to assassinate lustful male targets. These stories make for a hell of a lot more fun fiction than fact, as does Taki's tight spandex costume, which wouldn't have even been possible until the 1950s. Well, the chemical polymers needed to make spandex would be invented in the 1950s. Before then, tights were made out of wool, and Japan did not start farming sheep until they opened the borders in the later 1800s. And though her supernatural demon-hunting Fuma ninja clan shares a name with a real-life Fuma ninja clan, the real one specialized in horseback guerrilla warfare, not demon slaying. But no Soul Calibur character is more immersed in real-life hard Japanese history than Mitsurugi. Mitsurugi's home stage in Soul Blade is a supposed pirate base housing the real-life Murakama samurai clan that operated as pirates and, in the fiction of the game, trained him in swordsmanship. His stage in Soul Calibur is the real-life siege of Takamatsu Castle as it's happening, with the fort being flooded by the same guy who would later try to do 2 fruitless failed invasions into Korea. In fact, Mitsurugi's entire character is based on the real-life swordsman Miyamoto Musashi, a traveling ronin who killed tens of people while either working as a mercenary or when participating in his 61 undefeated duels. He famously would use wooden swords and staffs and still win, perhaps sparking Soul Calibur's idealism of equally matched weapon masters that can make a staff withstand the blows of a heavy axe. But unlike Mitsurugi, I couldn't find any claims that the real-life Musashi ever traveled outside of Asia, which was not strikingly rare at the time. Japanese isolationism hadn't yet officially begun, and Japanese pirates were pillaging the contested waters of East Asia, all of which gives cause to the plausibility of a Japanese naval mercenary like Mitsurugi being able to freely travel the world and go on all sorts of wacky adventures. Which actually did happen to at least 2 Japanese individuals known only by their baptismal names of Christopher and Cosmos, the first Japanese people to cross the Pacific. Their employment on these voyages was recorded by an English captain they sailed with, eventually ending in a shipwreck off the coast of Brazil. So, Yoshimitsu is basically a period-appropriate military samurai who's a crazy fictional demon under the mask. Taki is a sexy female ninja based on circumstantial rumors of sexy female ninjas made shameless enough for the 21st century. While Mitsurugi is a barely flashy, surprisingly grounded analog to a real-life traveling Ronin who has grown into a kind of national legend. That contextual inspiration, but not exactly historical accuracy, is what happens when fantastical ideology and real-life representation meet in historical fiction. The further away you get from Japan, the farther these character analogs start to stumble and tumble. Even with other Asian characters like Talam from the Philippines, who does represent a mishmash of modern Filipino cultural references, but doesn't personify a specific historical figure, nor the 16th century in Filipino history. Nunchaku did indeed come from the Ryukyu Islands, and so did Maxi. In fact, they were actually used to practice karate by the Okinawan nobles in history. Today, there's this whole subculture of Japanese Elvis fans that inspired Maxi's early costumes, and that began in the 1970s by neo-rockabilly bands coming out of Tokyo instead of from Okinawa. But what about the European characters? In the interest of fascinating the primarily English-speaking audience of this video and of myself, here's a rundown of the context inspiring some recurring souls who represent the other side of the commonly understood yet abstractly imagined border between Asia and Europe. As a Greek woman in the 16th century, Sophia would have technically been living in the Muslim Ottoman Empire, after Greece was previously ruled by the Christian Orthodox Byzantine Empire. While some Byzantine scholars noted that cults of ancient Greek paganism still existed in the country up to the 9th century, over the next 700 years those small pockets likely would have been converted out by both the Christians and then later the Muslims. Even though nowadays there is a Hellenism revival movement, some members of which claim their families never stopped worshipping these gods across such a massive span of time. Why is the religion of this area so important to Sophia? Sophia? Because somehow, after 1,000 years of pagan persecution, she's an Athenian-born devotee of Hephaestus, the ancient Greek god of metalworking. Hephaestus appears to Sophia and inspires her
what up?
Character design and the...
What's up, man? Learning Siegfried.
You are?
Yep.
Oh, what's that?
He's better than Nightmare.
Yeah, pretty much. How's it going?
I mean, I found some optimal stuff
How'd that tournament go?
here, and I lost my buddy because he used Baldo, and I didn't know what was going on.
Oh, what's your buddy's name?
Shimpala?
Oh, I know another Voldo player that's pretty good.
I don't know shit about Baldo.
Yeah,
to be
me
honest.
neither. I don't know what's going on, just like you.
So, like,
Yeah, that's his whole shtick is like you're just gonna stand there and eat everything. It says I can't join the room, Siegfried. Unable to join room. Yeah, I can't join you guys' room.
yeah, I'll make it.
Alright.
Preview. Oh, you stream on YouTube, huh?
Yeah. Well, I switch back and forth.
Das makes... Just because I was looking on Twitch, because I saw you were streaming.
Oh yeah, I switch back and forth. Lately, it's been YouTube.
I mean, I've never used YouTube. I've only ever used Twitch.
Yeah. Unable to join. I'm gonna restart my app.